Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. There's a widespread belief among climate alarmists that humans control the climate. This article in The Guardian from earlier this year is an excellent example. European colonization of Americas killed so many it cooled Earth's climate. European colonization of the Americas resulted in the killing of so many native people that it transformed the environment and caused the Earth's climate to cool down. Settlers killed off huge numbers of people in conflicts and also by spreading disease, which reduced the indigenous population by 90% in the century following Christopher Columbus's initial journey to the Americas and Caribbean in 1492. The large-scale depopulation resulted in vast tracts of agricultural land being left untended, researchers say, allowing the land to become overgrown with trees and other new vegetation. The regrowth soaked up enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to actually cool the planet, with the average temperature dropping by 0.15 C in the late 1500s and early 1600s. The study by scientists at University College London found. The amount of misinformation and propaganda in this article may be the worst I've ever seen. First problem is that nobody really knows how many Native Americans there were in 1492. Second problem is that the language they're using is incredibly inflammatory. Listen closely to the language they're using. Settlers killed off huge numbers of people in conflicts and also by spreading disease. They describe deaths from disease as being killing. Killing implies an intentional act of taking somebody's life. The indigenous peoples of America did not have immunity to diseases like smallpox and influenza. It's horrible that so many people died, but they were killed by viruses, not humans. To show how dishonest and inflammatory this language is, think about what happened in Europe in the prior century. Most of the people in Europe died from the Black Plague. The Black Plague was brought in from Central Asia. But nobody would be irresponsible enough to say that the Central Asians killed tens of millions of people in Europe. The Europeans were killed by a bacteria, not by Central Asians. The Guardian's language implies biological warfare. This sort of dishonest, inflammatory rhetoric is fairly typical for The Guardian, however. And then to top off all of their hateful accusations and propaganda, they say that the deaths of Native Americans led to a cooling of the planet. The assumption being that humans control the climate and that there's nothing else which could possibly have caused a small amount of cooling. I call this belief that the climate is centered around human activity Climocentricism. It's very similar to the beliefs of the 15th century that the Earth was the center of the universe. People of low intellect like to believe that everything in the universe revolves around them. In the year 1543, Copernicus presented a new idea that the sun was the center of the solar system. This made the orthodoxy very angry and led to the persecution of people like Galileo, who were threatened with prison and torture. We're dealing with exactly the same problem now in the 21st century. The orthodoxy believes that humans are at the center of the climate universe. Others believe that the sun is at the center of the climate universe, and they're viciously attacked as heretics. Now let's look at what actually happened to the climate over the past millennium and compare it to the fantasy story in The Guardian. This graph was in the 1990 IPCC report. It showed that Earth was very warm around the year 1200 during the medieval warm period, then cooled a lot down to the year 1600 in the Little Ice Age, and since then we've gained about half of the warmth back. This diagram shows no correlation between temperature and atmospheric carbon dioxide. Both the warmest period and the coldest period occurred at pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide. This graph destroyed global warming theory, so climate scientists reacted the way they always do. They changed the data. They got rid of the medieval warm period, they got rid of the Little Ice Age, and replaced it with Michael Mann's hockey stick. If climate scientists were actual scientists, they would have changed the theory to match the data. But they did the exact opposite. They changed the data to match the theory. Now let's look at the history of what they did. In 1981, James Hansen of NASA published a graph which was very similar to the one in the IPCC report from 1990. The 1981 graph showed a medieval warm period and a Little Ice Age, and then it showed some warming since the end of the Little Ice Age. Hansen's 1981 graph was based on temperatures in central England, tree limit in the White Mountains of California, and oxygen isotope measurements in the Greenland ice sheet. Hansen also published another graph showing cooling over the past 7,000 years. This was based on changes in tree lines, fluctuations of alpine and continental glaciers, and shifts in vegetation patterns recorded in pollen spectra. The medieval warm period was real and it was global. Let's look at some more of the evidence. In 1952, the New York Times reported that Greenland's ice is melting, and in the process, ruins of ancient farmhouses have been uncovered. This shows us that the climate of Greenland was very warm during the medieval warm period. In 1990, the New York Times reported a warming trend about 1,000 years ago, called the medieval maximum, enabled the Vikings to settle Greenland and vineyards to flourish in Britain. At that time, English wines were considered competitive with French wines, so the climate of England had to have been warmer then than it is now. Then the article went on. On the other hand, scientists say that about every 2,500 years, a little ice age cools the globe. In the most recent of these, lasting from the 15th century to the 19th century, the average temperature in Europe was nearly 3 degrees lower than today, and mountain glaciers advanced all over the world. Crops failed and villages starved in parts of Europe. The Hans Brinker story in Holland was set in this period, as was the ordeal of Washington's army at Valley Forge. In 1779 to 1780, New York Harbor froze solid. In 1992, the New York Times wrote, "Is globe warming? Not yet," researchers on tree rings say. North American trees showed the feathery but unmistakable signatures of the medieval warm period, an era from 1100 to 1375 AD, when, according to European writers of the time and other sources, the climate was so balmy that wine grapes flourished in Britain, and Vikings farmed the now frozen expanse of Greenland. We can now see that the medieval warm period and Little Ice Age were global climate phenomena, not regional temperature variations. The question is, how did we get those warmer temperatures during pre-industrial times? And that right there is the problem for climate alarmists. They can't explain it with carbon dioxide, and they can't explain it with their climate models. But the story gets worse for them in these paragraphs from the article. Through analyzing tree rings, the Arizona researchers have concluded they have yet to see the first fruits of the so-called greenhouse effect, the warming of the earth that many say will result from humanity's release of excessive heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. So wait a minute, this is 1992. We're way up Michael Mann's hockey stick, but tree ring researchers haven't seen any evidence of warming so far. This might make you a little bit suspicious about the quality of Michael Mann's work. But here comes the real killer. Donald Graybill, who studies bristlecone pine trees growing at high elevations in the wide mountains of eastern California, has evidence that the carbon released into the air by the burning of fossil fuels like coal and gasoline is sharply stimulating the growth of bristlecone pines, both by serving as fertilizer and by making the elderly wonders more efficient in their use of water. So not only is CO2 not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing, and it says it right there in the New York Times. In 1892, National Geographic reported that from the 10th to the 16th centuries, the glaciers of the Alps were much less extensive than at present, and that horses were able to cross passes now considered difficult by mountaineers. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the glaciers increased, attaining their greatest extent in the beginning of this century. So National Geographic knew about the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age more than a century before Michael Mann tried to erase them. In 1929, Auguste Boucher, scientist and engineer, speculated that there were no glaciers in Europe during the Middle Ages. In 1934, the New York Times reported that tree roots pierced the graves of Vikings who'd been buried during the medieval warm period in areas where it's now much too cold for trees to grow. Trees don't lie, but climate scientists do. The medieval warm period was much warmer than the present. In 1933, the Canberra Times reported that Dr. Stenberger unearthed the remains of a Scandinavian community that flourished 1,000 years ago under the mighty Icelandic chieftain Eric the Red. It consisted of about 3,000 people and was famed in the Viking tales, but it was mysteriously obliterated and lost some 400 years later. The Viking seat of Eric the Red proved to have been a large farm with 40 cows. Among other remains found were 4 churches and a convent for nuns. The Vikings were doing very well in Greenland during the medieval warm period, but every single one of them died during the Little Ice Age. This image and caption were from the November 1976 issue of National Geographic. Once upon a Little Ice Age, skaters glided on Dutch canals, earth shivered with cold, From 1400 to 1850, climate's chill breath nourished glaciers and ruined crops, breeding famine, plague, and revolt. The Guardian is going to have a tough time blaming things which occurred in 1400 on Christopher Columbus. This is a great article from 1891 reporting on English snowstorms during the Little Ice Age. A record of the cold snaps experienced in Great Britain during the last 2 centuries, 6 months of steady snow. The Great Snowstorm, when the Thames was frozen over for nearly 4 months, occurred in 1683 to 1684. The frost continued without intermission from December to February, snow coming down almost continuously. Remember, this is the same England which a few hundred years earlier had a flourishing wine industry competitive with that of France. Obviously, England cooled down a lot, going from the climate of the south of France to the climate of the Arctic. Here's a good paper from the Journal of Climatic Change dated 1994. They mapped the extent of glaciers during the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. They said that glaciers actually began to grow between the year 1250 and the year 1300, almost 200 years before Columbus came to America. Things are not looking good for the fraudsters at the Guardian. So we know that the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age were very real, and they were global. We know that the medieval warm period was much warmer than the present, and the Little Ice Age was much colder than the present. And we also learned that carbon dioxide makes bristlecone pine trees grow faster and more drought resistant. All of this information completely destroys global warming theory, so climate scientists reacted just as you would expect them to do. They colluded to erase the medieval warm period. In 2006, a geologist from the University of Oklahoma, Dr. David Deming, testified before the U.S. Senate. He said, "I had another interesting experience around the time my paper in Science was published, 1995. I received an astonishing email from a major researcher in the area of climate change. He said, 'We have to get rid of the medieval warm period.'" This sort of dishonesty should come as no surprise to anyone who's been following this discussion. Climate scientists cheat and tamper with data all the time, and Michael Mann is one of the worst. He erased the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. The actual temperature record does not support the idea that humans controlled the climate. But there's nothing new about blaming Europeans for climate change. On March 11, 1846, the Maitland Mercury reported on the change of climate. That great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia, all testimonies satisfactorily prove. The Aborigines say that the climate has undergone this change since white man came into the country. Blaming white men for climate change is almost a 200-year-old venture now. And the Guardian has brought self-hate to a new level of ugliness. The one important takeaway from this Guardian article is that they believe depopulation is necessary to cool the planet, which has always been the bottom line with climate alarmists since day one. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.